opening up the queen's diagonal and staking a claim in the center. This pawn push immediately begins contesting central space. Instantly contesting central influence, the knight boldly probes towards the heart of the board, setting the stage for dynamic counterplay. Asserting central control and preparing for an aggressive queenside expansion. Challenging the center immediately creates rich, dynamic play. Pawns march forward, seizing central space and initiating an immediate pawn chain battle. Asserting central space aggressively, black challenges white's pawn chain head-on. Developing the knight here solidifies central control and prepares to pressure black's advanced pawn. Securing central space now that white's pawn is advanced, this solidifies black's foothold and prepares for piece development. Solidifying the central pawn chain, white bravely ventures forward, aiming to seize more territory and launch an attack on the kingside. Unleashing the fianchetto offers dynamic counterplay, aiming to challenge white's central foothold. Bolstering the center pawn with f3 sacrifices immediate kingside development for a more solid pawn structure, potentially limiting black's aggressive bishop. The bishop finds its intended outpost, preparing for a kingside assault and influencing the d4 pawn. Pinning that knight creates immediate tactical pressure, forcing black to consider defensive maneuvers carefully. Challenging the bishop's influence directly, this pawn advance creates immediate questions about the light-squared diagonal's safety. Protecting the bishop while preparing to support the central pawn push aims to solidify white's space advantage. Securing the queenside flank now helps prevent white's nc3 from advancing further, maintaining the structural integrity of black's position. Repositioning the bishop aims to better support a central pawn push or a kingside attack, while eyeing weaknesses on the queenside. Unlocking the queenside, this knight prepares to support an eventual advance, subtly challenging white's central control. Developing the knight to the kingside aims to connect the rooks and prepare for a potential kingside pawn storm. This prepares to challenge the queenside pawn structure and potentially unchain the light-squared bishop. Shielding the king with a queen retreat, this move prepares for pawn advances and central control. Aggressively seizing space on the kingside creates immediate dynamic imbalances, potentially weakening your king's protective pawn shield. Castling queenside embraces the central tension, preparing to unleash a potent kingside pawn storm against the securely placed black monarch. Unleashing the queen, black aims to disrupt white's kingside castling and probe for weaknesses. Securing the king from potential queenside threats creates breathing room for a central pawn push. Securing the monarch in the fortress signals a shift toward building counterplay and solidifying the kingside defenses. Initiating a pawn storm, white aims to pry open the kingside, hoping to exploit the king's somewhat exposed position and create attacking chances. Initiating a kingside pawn storm disrupts white's queenside castling and seeks counterplay on that flank. Prioritizing the central dark-squared diagonal, this rook maneuvers to support potential kingside pressure and control the g-file. Shattering white's pawn structure, black boldly exchanges material to open lines towards the vulnerable king. Repositioning the bishop, white aims to support the central pawns and prepare for kingside action, while black's queenside play creates dynamic imbalances. Repositioning the knight towards the queenside, this move aims to improve its scope and support potential pawn breaks, while accepting a slight positional imbalance. Securing the king's escape route provides essential breathing room against black's developing queenside threats. A daring queen sortie, seeking counterplay and challenging white's central pawn structure. Securing the rook on the b-file now prepares for an eventual b4 pawn push, aiming to disrupt black's queenside initiative. Shifting the knight to f6 signals a readiness to defend and potentially counterattack along the central files, acknowledging the increased pawn structure complexity. This bishop exchange intends to dislodge black's knight from the vital f6 square, potentially opening a dangerous diagonal. Solidifying the knight's retreat path, this move aims to activate the bishop and prepare a kingside pawn storm. shielding the king with a rook on a newly secured file, preparing for a potent pawn storm advance. Intensifying control of the b-file while reinforcing the queenside structure, preparing for potential pawn advances or maneuvering of the rook. Nurturing knight outposts on the kingside opens up aggressive possibilities. Establishing a foothold on the b-file, this repositions the rook, eyeing potential advances and preparing for a queenside assault. Trading the bishop removes a key defender of the dark squares around black's king. Consolidating the king's safety after the pawn sacrifice, creating a more resilient defensive shell. Reorienting the knight to a more flexible central position, preparing for potential breakthroughs and reinforcing the kingside defense. Black reclaims initiative, aiming to pierce the pawn chain with the queen and potentially create open lines. Refocusing the knight to the kingside offers robust support for potential pawn advances and tactical maneuvers. Asserting a bishop onto the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's structural ambitions and potentially unpin black's knights. Initiating a flank attack, white sacrifices a pawn to pry open the kingside and disrupt black's defensive setup. Repositioning the queen to a more secure square, evading the potential capture and preparing for counterplay on the queenside. Unleashing a queenside assault, white hopes to pry open lines with this queen maneuver, aiming for disruption. Simplifying the position and securing the king from attacking lines appears to be the immediate goal. Rerouting the rook to the second rank aims to bolster the kingside pawn storm and increase pressure. Initiating pawn advances on the queenside signals an intention to disrupt white's king safety. Refocusing the knight to support the kingside advance, preparing for a potential pawn storm or piece battery. Anchoring the bishop to this square seems passive, potentially allowing white to build an overwhelming kingside attack without sufficient counterplay. Challenging black's queenside control, this aims to disrupt their pawn structure and potentially open lines. Unleashing pressure on the queenside, aiming to destabilize white's pawn structure with an active rook. Aggressively opening lines toward black's king, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure. A bold sacrifice that aims to disrupt white's queenside and open lines, though it invites a dangerous pawn storm. Clearing the kingside for a decisive pawn storm, exploiting black's exposed king. A bold attempt to reignite counterplay by sacrificing material on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's central dominance. Exploiting the open f-file, white boldly crashes through to shatter black's defensive structure around the king. Unlocking the center with the queen creates immediate diagonal threats and opens avenues for piece activity. Sharpening the central pawn structure immediately after castling opens critical lines and forces black to confront the unleashed white battery. Embracing the doubled pawn, black aims to activate the queen and potentially disrupt white's kingside assembly. Trading queens simplifies the position, potentially leading to an endgame where pawn weaknesses become more prominent. Simplifying to an endgame after the queen trade opens lines, but watch out for white's central pawn push. Seizing the open file with the rook transforms the game into a race against black's advanced pawns. Seeking to reclaim material and activate the rook, this move reintroduces complications into a seemingly simplified position. A dramatic exchange, leaving white with a dominant rook on the 7th rank and a clear path to victory. Recapturing the piece with the knight now brings a potentially active defender to the center, although it must be wary of the weakened kingside. Consolidating the rook onto the 7th rank offers a strong outpost, potentially trapping the knight. Shifting the rook to the b-file aims to secure it from threats and potentially pressure white's exposed pieces. Capturing the pawn exploits a temporary pin and opens lines toward black's vulnerable king. Activating the rook for potential central domination now that the queens are exchanged. Puncturing the queenside with a pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's rook activity and potentially create weaknesses. Recapturing the pawn is a logical, though perhaps passive, response, allowing white to consolidate. Opening lines of communication is key, and the knight repositions to eye potential central breakthroughs or support an attack. Consolidating the king behind its pawn chain offers modest safety amidst the pawn storm. Dominating the open file forces black's knight into a passive post. Unleashing pawns in the center, black aims to disrupt white's queenside and create counterplay. Unleashing the passed pawn at d6 now seizes central space and forces a difficult decision for black's rook. Unleashing the rook to contest open files offers a dynamic counterplay to white's king invasion. Challenging the pinned knight on d3 directly injects dynamism into the position. The king cautiously seeks refuge behind the advancing pawn wall, hoping to consolidate. Seizing the open file with the rook, this forces a material exchange and simplifies the position, potentially heading towards a favorable endgame. The king desperately seeks safety, but the passed pawn looms large. A decisive pawn thrust, aiming to unlock the queen and shepherd it towards promotion. A desperate attempt to create counterplay, but it loosens the king's defenses even further. The rook vacates the 7th rank, setting up a decisive counterplay in the central files. Recapturing the pawn, black reopens the g-file, aiming to activate their queen and potentially tie down white's rook. Securing the knight's position opens up the c-file for potential endgame pressure. Opening the h-file allows the black king to breathe and potentially escape its current confinement. Unleashing the knight to threaten black's compromised pawns and create mating possibilities. Black desperately tries to salvage material by offering a rook exchange, but it will only simplify white's winning position. Seizing the open file, this rook maneuver begins a decisive endgame advantage. Unblocking the bishop to eye the queen feels like a passive response to the pawn push. Unleashing a knight fork, this move seizes the pawn and disrupts black's remaining forces. King's safety now paramount as white liquidates material for a mating attack. Securing the 8th rank is a wise defensive maneuver, preventing further encroachment by the opponent's rook. Rescuing the king from the open lines and preparing for a potential pawn push seems to be the immediate priority. King hunting begins as the knight swarms, aiming to disrupt the exposed monarch. Unleashing the king opens up potential mating nets as the knight heads for promotion. A timely knight fork that clears the path for your rook. The king's active sortie, though bold, exposes it to potential harassment on the light squares. Securing the d-file for a potential infiltration creates immense pressure. Unveiling the bishop allows it to contest the open d-file and support its advanced passed pawn. Reclaiming the pawn on c4 shores up white's queenside pawns and prepares for a more active rook endgame. The black king is being actively drawn into the fray, potentially facing dangers from the advanced white pieces. Sacrificing the rook opens a clear path for your king to dominate the queenside pawn structure. Recognizing the inevitable pawn exchange, black solidifies the bishop's role on this critical diagonal. Securing the bishop's defensive post consolidates white's advantage, forcing black's king into a precarious corner. Black liberates their rook, aiming to activate it on the open file and harass white's exposed king. Securing the queenside pawn with this move begins solidifying white's material advantage. Solidifying the bishop's position and offering a potential outpost for the knight. Opening this diagonal creates a powerful attack against the black king's remaining defenders. Shifting the king towards the center opens up possibilities for counterplay, aiming to join the attack. Clearing the way for the rook to access open files after the pawn sacrifice. Gambiting the bishop on b5 might create space for the rook to maneuver, but it sacrifices valuable defensive potential. Securing the queenside by anchoring the rook on the 2nd rank prevents black's bishop from interfering with the pawn advance.